Our world is just like this. In a city that claimed to know about God and appeared very religious, the Greeks were very ignorant. And Paul was a barbaric Jew, as the Greeks would refer to him, telling the enlightened Greeks that they were ignorant. And Paul said this to their faces. Well, who were the Greeks to say that Paul had pieced together various views on God, when in fact they had visible testimony throughout their greatest city that they honored various views of God, whose view was right? How could they say Paul's view was wrong? The Greeks observed the world and drew logical and reasoned conclusions about God that varied widely based on the number of altars and idols in Athens. And using reason and logic, which the Greeks themselves used, Paul revealed the false conclusions the Greeks had drawn about God, and he replaced those false conclusions with truth. To the rhetorical question that went unasked, who's to say your view is any more valid than ours, Paul answered preemptively in his address, God gave evidence of himself and his intentions by sending a certain man. And to the question then begged, well, how do you know this man is from God, and reveals his expectations? Paul again anticipates and says, we know because God raised him from the dead. These are the truths that we should be using. And the Greeks thought by their own reasoning their worldview made the most sense. Paul addressed their worldview and showed how it was illogical and contradictory. Paul hung the truth of God on the person of Christ and the person of Christ on the resurrection. Paul told the Greeks exactly what they needed to hear, and he didn't hold back. He didn't stop and think, well, this might offend them, or, well, they might get mad at me if I say this. He was committed to proclaiming the truth, and he was able to tell these people that they were ignorant and in need of truth without offending them. And he did so because he loved them the way that God loves them. Like Paul, we're to be prepared to say what needs to be heard by the people we encounter if we love them. The last thing we note from this passage in the verses that follow is the response of the audience, and it has a direct reflection on today's text. The resurrection brought mocking and conflict. However, it always does, because of the reality of condemnation and conviction. This is why the resurrection and the person of Christ are always under attack. If these truths stand, then any other system and worldview collapses. The lives people enjoy living are suddenly condemned, and the world hates this. The resurrection means that there is something after this life, and consider what that means to people who think that life ends at death and live based on that. The resurrection means that Jesus is who he said, and what he said is true, and therefore anyone in any other belief system must rethink everything he believes to be true. Think about how hard that is for some people. The Athenians had many views of the gods. They even had an altar where they admitted ignorance about God and couldn't even build an idol to describe it. But they were sure Paul's view was wrong. And this is what we see in the world today too. People say, well, we have no way to know God. All the views of God are a partial view and lead people to God, like the video we saw right before the message today. However, when they respond to Christianity, they're certain it's wrong. We can't know for sure, but we're certain Christianity is wrong. Does that make sense? It didn't to Paul either. Did Paul make a judgment about these people? Yes, he did. Was his message judgmental? No. Paul was humble and respectful. He looked at what they believed. He asked reasonable questions about their beliefs and showed where their own beliefs did not even stand up against common sense. Paul compared what God said to what these people said, and using their own beliefs, led them to see where they were in error, how they could come to know the truth, and gave them the opportunity to choose the truth of God rather than their own ideas. This is not being judgmental. This is serving those in need, and we are called to bear witness to the truth of Christ. But how can we bear witness to the truth if we don't even fully understand it ourselves? How can you fulfill your calling if you do not know what you believe? Notice also in the midst of commotion, almost as a quiet little footnote, the text tells us of two other responses. It says, some wanted to know more. See, by what Paul said, he had left an uncomfortable little pebble in their shoes. It also says that at least two people named there believed and were converted. We see that the leading of the Spirit and Paul's obedience resulted in salvation for at least those two named. Paul was in Athens for those people. Paul demonstrates repeated, consistent obedience to the Spirit, readiness to his calling to bear witness to the truth, wherever and whenever the opportunity arose, and to whoever would listen. Well, that was then. What about now? Does this still apply to us? Well, this account offers many timeless lessons that still apply to us. The gospel had the same power to convert skeptics in Athens as it did in places like Thessalonica or Berea. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, whether they are pagan Greeks in Athens or religious Jews in Jerusalem. Believers are always led by the Spirit and are never anywhere by coincidence. What may be viewed as a sidetrack on the supposed program for one's ministry may in fact be part of the Spirit's purpose. Believers are to be sensitive and responsive to the activity of the Spirit, whatever the circumstances may be. Christians never know who their hearers might be or where their circumstances might lead. But the power and truth of the gospel is equally effective in any audience, whether it's Jerusalem or Athens or Fredericksburg, Virginia. No group should be considered unreachable. Many times, Christians might believe themselves to be as far as possible from where they believe the Spirit desires them, or that the audience is far too daunting for their level of preparedness. However, this Athens account shows us that believers are never outside of God's purposes, and even in circumstances that seem impossibly beyond one's control, the gospel is the power of God to save for all who believe. And so how do we apply these? It's nice to know these things, but how do we apply them? Well, the passage calls each of us to obedience. And these following points are not merely to know, but to apply. First, our ministry is God's, and we must be ready to serve when He calls. Christians may believe they have a specific calling from the Lord and become focused on it to the exclusion of everything else. Though Paul was waiting either to begin his ministry when the rest of the team arrived or resume the circuit that he had determined to follow, he didn't allow his own idea of God's purposes to prevent him from preaching the gospel to whoever might hear. See, if we are to be conformed to the image of Christ, then we would do well to listen to His example. He does what He sees the Father doing and speaks what the Father gives Him to say. At least that's what He said in John 5:19 and 12:49.